Radio Row was a segment of New York's downtown Manhattan that had many stores that repaired, sold, and manufactured electronics in the early 1920s up until 1966. Due to World War II, there were shortages of goods such as can openers, blankets, and hardware, many of which were diverted to the war effort, and made importing goods difficult as well. New parts needed for the manufacturing and upkeep of electronics were also scarce to come by, so Radio Row was struggling to keep up with demand. War times were rough on American life, and the situation needed some sort of economic development. So in 1943, the state of New York had passed legislature to give Governor Thomas Dewey the power to develop plans to do just that. However, nothing was made of those plans yet until 1949. David Rockefeller had proposed to the mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, the idea of utilizing that economic growth bill to build a World Trade Center. Now, most people call the Twin Towers the World Trade Center, and that's mainly because it was the first of its kind at the time. Now, a World Trade Center is a place that assists firms and provides services for national and global trade. The project fell into the hands of the New York and New Jersey Port Authority. The governor of New Jersey, Robert Minor, didn't want to have a part of it, as he didn't think New York was deserving of the $335 million for the project. The Port Authority, however, met with Richard Hughes, governor-elect, a year later, and decided to house the World Trade Center by the Hudson Terminal, that was owned by the Hudson and Manhattan Railroad, reclaiming it for themselves so New Jersey residents could have easier access to the World Trade Center. This, however, was right where Radio Row was. In 1965, as the Port Authority was acquiring land to build this project, it gave each business on Radio Row $3,000, a flat fee no matter the assets, to relocate. What's worse is that even after the economic low that was wartime America, both the radio and television were booming in the 1960s, and the businesses were forced out due to eminent domain, where the government takes private property and turns it into publicly used land. The residents of Radio Row didn't go down without a fight, however, and several businesses brought on a court case challenging the eminent domain by the Port Authority. It reached the Supreme Court, but then quickly ended as they refused to even hear the case. Head architect of the project was Minoru Yamasaki, who had just years before, in 1962, designed the Seattle Pacific Science Center for the World's Fair. In 1966, a proposed Battery Park City began to make a comprehensive community right by the remains of Radio Row. In 1968, construction on the World Trade Center began, and Battery Park City was used as a landfill for the construction of the two towers, with cofferdams filled with sand that were made to hold the materials, and in 1973, the buildings were completed. In the 1980s, as the landfill was continually piling up, many people were using the sand that wasn't for public use as a beach. Environmental graphic designers David Vender Einden and Chris Calori described the site, quote, "There was nothing there yet, and there were spectacular views of the towers across the river." These towers turned into icons of the city, where many high-profile events, such as the tightrope walk between the towers by acrobatic performer Philip Petit was, and appearing in over 472 films. On the first day of May of 1982, conceptual artist Agnes Dennis grew a 2-acre wheat field on this landfill in Battery Park City. This was a land art piece, which is art that is created within or involving a landscape or drawn from materials from a landscape. It was also a piece of environmental art, as Dennis deliberately chose the location of the piece to be atop a landfill created to specifically cater to the large structures that were just a stone's throw away. Not only that, it was a critique on capitalism and the way in which we use our land, and also the commodification of things such as wheat and how they were traded. In her words,
"My decision to plant a wheat field in Manhattan instead of designing just another public sculpture grew out of the long-standing concern and need to call attention to our misplaced priorities and deteriorating human values. Placing it at the foot of the World Trade Center, a block away from Wall Street facing the Statue of Liberty, also had symbolic importance. It represented food, energy, commerce, world trade, economics. It referred to mismanagement, waste, world hunger, and ecological concerns.
With the growing civil rights movements, second-wave feminism, and the Vietnam War, Agnes Dennis was in a society and culture that was fighting against a system that had benefited from war, oppression, and environmental destruction. In the words of Barbara Rose, a dissatisfaction with the current social and political system results in an unwillingness to produce commodities which gratify and perpetuate that system. Here, the sphere of ethics and aesthetics merge. Most importantly, this art piece was one of the most expensive pieces of land in the world at the time, but because the trash the landfill was housing, 200 truckloads of dirt were brought in and 285 furrows were dug by hand and cleared of rocks and garbage. In June of 1982, the wheat had begun to sprout, creating a picturesque rustic crop that hadn't been seen in New York City in over 300 years. Agnes Dennis had worked for 16 hours a day in the field, with volunteers helping occasionally. For those who visited the piece, questionnaires were handed out about human values, the quality of life, and the future of humanities. In August of that year, all of the wheat was harvested, producing over 1,000 pounds of healthy wheat. The seeds traveled to exhibitions of the International Art Show for the End of World Hunger in the 1980s, where the seeds were taken by many people and harvested around the globe. What's so striking about the piece are the photos taken by photographer John McGraw, which makes justice of the name Wheatfield, a confrontation. The photos show a deep contrast to the golden beauty of the wheat and the metal concrete jungle that it faces, as if it was not only standing defiantly, but with conviction. A photo of the wheat field looking at the Twin Towers, planted firmly on the landfill that they had created, a contradiction of sorts, as it stares at the buildings where things such as wheat were traded daily. A photo of the wheat facing the Statue of Liberty, interestingly enough, the first time the statue had ever seen wheat, one of the staple foods produced in the United States in its 97 years in the country at the time. While the piece was up, many workers of the World Trade Center would come down and interact with the piece. Men and women in suits came down for their lunch break to see the field and enjoy the feeling of reconnecting with something natural after being in the office all day.
I remember the smells of it more than anything else. That, it smelled so fresh. The city didn't smell so good. It smelled oily and whatever. But there was something it was like smelling the outdoors in New York.
And this is all according by design. Agnes wanted the residents of the city to question the land that they're on, the daily lives that they have in their offices, and to reconnect with the land that they're on. And that's the connection that I have to this piece. A time capsule with photos were buried to be opened in 2979, 1,000 years after the event, mainly to call into question whether our species will still be around to uncover it. The wheat field was grown and then harvested, and now the landfill that was Battery Park City has been replaced with the actual project that they had it for. But I think that the power that this art piece has, a reclaiming of the land and our relationship with it, is a very important one imposed by these art pieces, such as Alan Sonfist's Time Landscape in central New York City, a strip of land consisting of plants indigenous to the land before colonial times. Though for many it is a glimpse into the past, much like Agnes Dennis's artwork, it calls into question the systems that we have in our present, our usage of land and resources, and what we consider natural. And by not having it framed in a building or framed out in our daily lives, and instead just be a part of the landscape, it asks us to ask ourselves questions I know environmentalists and land back supporters ask often, but also points the question at Wall Street brokers and international trade firms. How are we using this land? What kind of systems got us to where we are now? Is any of this sustainable, and is this the right way to live here on Earth?